The Middle East Institute. We are delighted to be able to host the discussion today on refugees and IDPs from conflict areas. Our two speakers, Susanne Schmeidl, has lived and worked in Afghanistan since 2000. And if you recall that, check your calendar, that you can see that places her there during the Taliban regime. So she has seen it all. She's seen it, the Taliban regime. She's seen the changes that came after October 7. And then she has lived there, worked, and monitored the war as it's developed. And she'll have quite an interesting perspective to give you today on how that's affected the people, particularly the displaced. Susanne is co-founder and director of the Liaison Office, which I believe does work with refugees and civil society and development and civilian peace building, and we're lucky to have her today to be able to draw on her wisdom both as a practitioner and as an academic. Geraldine Chatelard, is that how you pronounce it? I'm sorry. Is a social anthropologist and a Middle East historian. She's completed her doctoral work in Les Écoles des Hautes Études de Sciences Sociales, or something like that, in Paris. And she has been working in and around the Middle East for the last 17 years. And Geraldine is currently living in Amman, where she's writing a book on the Iraqi refugees and IDP situation. And she also has some very penetrating perceptions about what's happening there. So Middle East Institute welcomes you both, and they will speak for about 10 minutes each, 10, 15 minutes each, and then we'll open up for questions and answers to the group. Thank you. It's on.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador.
Just pull it closer.
Thank you for the introduction. Unfortunately, as I always be reminded, I haven't seen it all because I missed the hippie times in Afghanistan when there were still trees on the road. I always envy the people who actually saw it when it was a pretty country and much more secure to move around. Well, thank you for having me. If I'm a bit drowning, I still struggle a bit from jet lag. I came from Kabul, and my jet lag seems to work in funny ways these days. Now, Afghanistan is probably known for the fact that it used to be, post-World War II, it was one of the biggest refugee crises in the world, at times accounting for 60, depending on the numbers, at least 60% of the world refugee population. Unlike Sudan, which probably has the claim to fame of having the largest internal displaced population, Afghanistan had the largest externally displaced population due to fairly liberal asylum policies in the neighboring countries of Pakistan and Iran. The majority of the refugees had gone to Pakistan, was about 2/3 and then 1/3 in Iran. There are several others, mostly the elite, that also went to largely Europe, within Europe, largely Germany, and also North America, but also Australia, etc. So there's a quite considerable diaspora of the Afghans overseas. It's mostly elite. And it is also a way what the Afghans are using with their own personal resettlement program. There's fairly a lot of intermarriage going on, where particularly girls, but also sometimes boys, are being married over to somebody overseas and then have a foot in the door to be able to go to Europe or North America in the past. Now, the Afghan refugee population has been considered protracted because there have been various waves. There have been in the history various incidents where people thought, okay, Afghanistan is changing, and people were returning. Once were after the Soviet army withdrew, but that didn't quite work out because then a civil war ensued. Then when the Taliban basically took over Afghanistan, there were a lot of return movement as well, not as large because people were getting cautious, but again, then the Taliban didn't quite turn out to be the savior that people thought them to be. And more displacement happened afterwards. And then the biggest one was post-2001, when a US-led intervention got rid of the Taliban regime and ushered in a new area for Afghanistan with a new democratic government, and which actually led to the largest assisted return movement, assisted the most rapid return movement in UNHCR's history, when at one point more refugees returned to Afghanistan where were thought to have left in the first place, particularly from Pakistan, already indicating the difficulty of actually gauging numbers and indicating the difficulty of monitoring whether or not people are recycling back and forth across the border. The border is really fluid. You can still cross the border without passports. I actually went to Tokham last year just to see how things have changed, given that now there's actually Marines there. And you could literally still walk up to the border and see the Pakistani border guards shake hands with people that cross the border. We were told by the Marine that stopped us, "Oh, you have passports. That's something really rare to be seen here." He was also a bit puzzled to see internationals at all in that area. So a lot of Afghans have returned, but the question is, have we seen an end to the Afghan refugee crisis? And I would say, unfortunately, we have not. I think we'd like to think that, because obviously right now, particularly the US, would like to think that they're having a success or an ability to stabilize Afghanistan so they can withdraw. And once again, what has happened in the Afghan refugee history is that we've seen a kind of like politicization of displacement, where we use figures or where we acknowledge or don't acknowledge figures to fit our narrative. And I think right now it fits our narrative not to acknowledge the displacement is continuing and is on the rise again, mostly internally, however. And the narrative that's now being spun is that most of the displacement is temporary. People leave shortly while fighting is going on, and then they will return to their homes, not understanding that if you were a rational actor, there's a highly unlikely scenario for you to actually return to a place where there's fighting, where potentially the Taliban could harass you because the Americans visited you the night before, or where you may have aerial bombing. So we actually have seen much more long-term displacement. The displaced, we've talked to a lot more people that actually plan not to go back to where they left. So this whole, I would say, wishful thinking of short-term internal displacement is just simply not true in Afghanistan. That's that. However, I think we also still know far too little about it, because we really haven't looked into the population, and just because the country has become so largely inaccessible, particularly for international actors, to even speak to the displaced population. There's various reasons why we're seeing the shift from an external displacement to an internal displacement, and that has a lot to do with the fact that borders are starting to close. Well, even though the borders are fluid, the reception in host countries is no longer as nice as it used to be. Pakistan has been starting to close a lot of camps down, is not so receptive anymore to the Afghan refugees. It basically scapegoated them into being the ones that are driving the insurgency. But then, let's face it, also, Pakistan is no longer as good as a country as it was. Insecurity is on the rise in Pakistan. The country is no longer as stable as it used to be. And you are competing in terms of assistance with internal displaced people that have come from the disasters within Pakistan. Iran, on the other hand, is quite open in the fact, while they still allow a certain amount of people to stay in their country, they have been the most open about deporting actually the ones they don't want or they consider illegal migrants. So they've been, quite open deportation movements. And also they don't have as many rights as they used to have to be. So it's basically, I think there's an internal displacement because the exit options basically are closed off or starting to close off, or are no longer as attractive as they used to be in the past.